Zion Church. My name is Devin Peterson. I'm the pastor here, and I'm just so excited that you've joined us today. If I didn't get a chance to meet you today, I'd love to do so. Please come find me. If I don't come find you, I'd love to learn your name. I'd love to get connected with you, find out how we can better serve you as a church family. You might notice that my voice is a little weak today. I woke up Wednesday morning, and I couldn't talk at all, and I was thinking, man, Wednesday is really close to Sunday, and I was getting a little concerned, but my voice came back. It was really strong on Friday. I preached 2 services, so it's getting weak again. So I might be a little softer spoken, maybe not as loud as usual, and everybody said amen, right? But bear with me, it's sticking there for a little bit. Well, hey, once again, welcome. You are joining us as we continue and finish our series, Don't Drop the Promise. You can turn with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. We'll be looking at the story of Joseph today. As you turn, and by the way, if you want to follow along in our sermon notes, you can scan this QR code. It takes you to YouVersion. All of our sermon notes are on YouVersion. You can also go to our website, mzpraise.org. If you scroll down under our service times, it says check us out on Church Center. That will take you to the notes as well. Well, a couple things that I just wanted to bring to your attention before we get started. We mentioned it earlier that the mid-year update is tonight. Now, my wife pointed out that June is not mid-year, and we're going to do it anyway. So this is an opportunity for us to come together and for us to talk about just what God has been doing here. We're going to look at our financial report, and we're going to look at some of the stories and statistics of what God is doing as we celebrate the testimonies of transformation here at Mount Zion. We invite all members, even the new ones, to come and join us tonight. And if you're not a member, we still invite you to come so that you can see what God is doing here. And maybe you'll be inspired to get more plugged in. Also wanted to let you know, how many of you were a part of the evangelism class that we had a couple months ago? Quite a few of you. Awesome, awesome. Well, we had an evangelism class, and it was really phenomenal, but we didn't want to just give theory. We also wanted to give an opportunity for practice. And so Sean Hoffmaster, who led that group, got connected to FCA, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and we are going to be hosting at their headquarters a World Cup watch party. Now, all types of people are going to be coming together, and it'll be an opportunity for us to come together, to hang out with these individuals, and hopefully have an opportunity to share the gospel, to talk a little bit about our testimony, and we all come together. We might be coming from all different walks of life, but we all come together for a common goal. Now, I got a better laugh in the first service, a common goal. It's the World Cup, come on. No, we're coming together because we know a lot of people are going to be interested in it, and it gives an opportunity for us to evangelize and share the gospel with them. That's going to be June 22nd at 5 p.m., as well as June 24th at 6 p.m. at the FCA headquarters right off Prospect Mill Road. We invite you to come. Even if you weren't a part of the evangelism class, still come, share your faith, share your testimony. Well, hopefully you have found your way to Genesis chapter 37 now. We've been in our series, Don't Drop the Promise. How many of you have been blessed by this series? It's been incredible having Steve Presser and Dave Bennett come up and share. What a powerful story that Dave shared last week about wrestling with God and just the testimony that came out of such a difficult time in his life. Well, we've been looking at the life of Abraham. We've been looking at the life of Isaac. We've been looking at the life of Jacob. And today, we're going to be looking at the life of Joseph. And this whole series is not just for us to learn cool facts and figures about the 4 patriarchs, but it's for us to respond to a call for intergenerational unity. We've been talking about unity this year, and unity in all different shapes and forms. And one place of division that is so consistent in the church at general, not Mount Zion, I know that, but the church at general is division among the generations. One generation looks at the next and says, you're not as important as I am. That tends to happen in so many churches. And that's what we see through the patriarchs, is that God has given a promise. A promise was made to Abraham. He received that promise. That promise was then passed to Isaac. It was then passed to Jacob. But Jacob had to wrestle with it. He had to make it his own. He had to wrestle with it and find the truth for himself. And now we find Jacob's son, Joseph. And I hope that as we've unpacked this, you've seen this core idea that God's promise advances when every generation embraces its assignment and refuses to compete for significance. I'm going to say that one more time. God's promise advances when every generation embraces its assignment and refuses to compete for significance. We stand here today, a legacy of 165 years worth of generations that came before us. A group of individuals who got together in a blacksmith shop right up the street, probably where that Walgreens is, on a prayer meeting during the middle of the Civil War to pray. And from that prayer meeting, a church was birthed. We are here today because of those prayers that have been answered. We are here today because a church was built out of the faith of those who came before us. It requires generation after generation after generation to pass on the promise. The promise needs more than one generation. Now, when we talk about God and we ever mention that He needs something, I want to clarify, God doesn't need more than one generation. So why did He choose to do it? Well, simply that. He chose to do it. When God does something, it's not because He has to, it's because He chose to. This is how He chooses to operate generation after generation after generation. Psalm 145:4 says, "One generation will declare your works to the next and will proclaim your mighty acts." What we see here is a generation who knows who God is, proclaiming and preaching the good news to the next. This is how the gospel has been passed down, transmitted generation upon generation. One generation that sees it and lives it and preaches it to the next so that the next is ready and can pick it up and carry it on. And while that's an inspiring phrase, an inspiring verse, there's an equally important verse that we must understand. Judges chapter 2 verse 10 says, "That whole generation was also gathered to their ancestors. After them another generation rose up who did not know the Lord or the works He had done for Israel." So we see in Psalm that we're supposed to pass on the promise to the next generation. But it's a very real reality that one generation may wake up and never have received the promise. What we see is that the promise is always only one generation from being dropped. The 165-year history that we have is because individuals such as these members who stood up today said, "I want to take responsibility for passing on the promise." But if one generation said, "No, we're just going to focus our attention on ourselves," we may not be here today, at least not in this room. The promise is only ever one generation from being dropped. We've talked a lot about dropping the promise. We've talked about how this is what we're trying to avoid. But maybe you're wondering, well, what does it look like to drop the promise? What would it actually mean to drop the promise? Well, first of all, the promise is dropped when we don't pass it. You may have faith and you may know who God is. You may know what Jesus Christ did for you. But if we don't pass it on to someone else, then we'll drop the promise. This is why we're having the watch party at FCA, because we know the truth. We have freely received, and now it's our job to freely give. So we go into an environment to share the gospel with people who maybe have never heard it before. The promise can be dropped when we don't pass it. But equally so, the promise can be dropped when it's not received. I've made it very clear in this series that this is not my intention to target one generation that I feel is at fault and say, you need to do better, but it's to look at all generations in the room, and there are many, and say we all have a responsibility. We all are responsible for carrying the weight of the promise. It could be passed, but if one generation doesn't receive it, it'll be dropped. But receiving it doesn't just mean to inherit it. Receiving it means that you understand that you're a part of something so much bigger than yourselves. My family and I went back home to Texas last week, and our family was there. And one thing I wanted to make sure that I was able to do was take at least my oldest son, Grayson, he's 5, been asking a lot of questions about my dad who passed away about 12 years ago. I wanted to take him to my dad's gravesite and have a conversation with him. And so we went, and Lincoln, my middle son, was in this car sleeping. He's 3, doesn't ask a lot of questions, but he was sleeping. And me and Grayson had a conversation about my dad, and I shared with him some of the legacy that I had inherited from my dad, the importance of that. And we were having a good conversation, and Grayson said, "Can I go get Lincoln? I want him to see it too." I said, "Sure." So he went to the car and he got Lincoln, and Lincoln came back and he's tired from his nap, and he's standing by the grave and he's just kind of listening to what I'm saying, and I'm telling him about my dad and how Lincoln actually shares the same middle name as my dad. And Lincoln kind of looks up at me and goes, "Can I go back to the car now?" You know, he didn't really care. But it was important to me. Then I let my kids know, you are a part of a legacy. Your story didn't start with you. Your story was a part of something so much bigger. You have to receive the promise, otherwise it will get dropped. But there's another issue that arises so often, and it's probably more prevalent in the church. It's probably the bigger reason why the promise gets dropped, and it's because generations begin to fight for attention. Generations begin to fight for the spotlight. Generations begin to fight for the resources to be invested in them at the expense of other generations, because after all, it's my time, right? When we begin to obsess over legacy, legacy is important. I wanted my kids to understand where we came from. I wanted them to know that we are believers because my dad came before us and he cultivated that faith in me. He passed that down to me. They need to understand the legacy of the promise. But sometimes our focus on legacy becomes so much more about just being remembered. We want to remember the impact that we make on society. But I want to draw your attention back to that very first week that I spoke on Abraham. And I reminded you that there are tons of genealogies in the Bible. And often we gloss over them or don't read them at all. But if you stop and you consider that each of these names were a lifetime. It was a person who lived, who mourned, who went through difficult times, and yet we have forgotten them to history. Let it be a humble reminder that we get so caught up in our own story and being remembered that we forget that our lifetime is just a very, very short part of a much larger story. We focus on being remembered, and we forget that it's not about being remembered, it's about making sure that the next generation remembers what's important. But if we're not careful, the church will begin to fight for attention. We'll begin to compare, and this is what's happening in Joseph's story. Remember, Abraham passed the promise to Isaac, who passed the promise to Jacob. Jacob now is an old man, and he has 12 sons. Yeah, I said that right, 12 sons. He had a lot of sons. One of those sons was named Joseph. And in Genesis 37:3, it says, now Israel, Jacob's name was changed to Israel whenever he fought and he wrestled with the Lord. Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age. And he made a robe of many colors for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. So you have 10 brothers, because Joseph's younger brother Benjamin either hadn't been born yet or he wasn't really in the picture. You have 10 brothers who are not the favorite, one brother who is the favorite. He's getting all of his father's attention. Now Joseph didn't do himself any favors because Joseph was a very gifted individual. He dreamed dreams, and later we'll see that Joseph, he has a gift of interpreting dreams. I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler on the story. Many of you probably know it. What we're going to see is where Abraham passed the promise and Isaac received the promise and Jacob wrestled with the promise, Joseph protects the promise. At the end of his story, he becomes the second most powerful man in Egypt, arguably the second most powerful man in the world. God puts him in a position because of his giftings to not only save the civilized world, but specifically protect the promise. What we see here is that Joseph in his early years, he is not doing himself any favors because as he has these dreams, he doesn't keep it to himself. He knows the favoritism that he has, and he runs up to his brothers and he says, hey, you gotta hear the dream that I had last night. And in this dream, he begins to tell that all of the brothers, they were harvesting wheat. And suddenly the wheat of his brothers began to bow down to his sheaf of wheat. And there seems to be a level of importance to Joseph in this dream. And he goes, but wait, there's more. And you can just imagine the brothers saying, oh, great, we can't wait to hear it, Joseph. Tell us more. And then Joseph says, well, there were 10 stars, or 11 stars, and there was the sun, and there was the moon, and suddenly you all began to bow down to me. there's this importance. Now, this was a real dream. It was a God-given dream. This was something God had instilled in him, but the brothers couldn't see it. And in fact, his father Joseph, who favored him, even said, Joseph, you may want to simmer down just a little bit because I don't think that what you're saying is right, but I want you to notice in chapter 37, verse 11, it says his brothers were jealous of him, and I can understand why. But his father kept the matter in mind. And I want you to put a pin in that for just a moment. His father kept the matter in mind. You see, because of the favoritism, and because Joseph was gifted, and because he had his father's focus, he was being compared. His brothers were comparing themselves to him. Comparison kills the promise. Comparison kills the promise. Now, let's give a little bit of a background. Joseph had 12 sons, as I said. He had 10 who were born to his first wife, Leah, and the other 2 were born to his second wife, Rachel. Now, Jacob worked 7 years for Leah. He was deceived, didn't realize he was working for her, thought he was working for Rachel, but on the night of their wedding, he realizes that he actually married Leah, not Rachel. Now, these women are sisters. His father-in-law said, well, it's customary for the older to go first, and so if you'll work for me for another 7 years, then you can have Rachel as well. So he works another 7 years, and so he marries sisters, and that worked out really, really well. It was just a great family dynamic. No, there was a great deal of dysfunction in this family, and even though he favored Rachel over Leah, God blessed Leah to have 10 sons, and Rachel only had 2 much later in life. But because it was much later in life, Jacob favored Joseph. He was the son of favor. There's a few reasons why Jacob favored Joseph, but what you got to understand is that he did. He was loved more, Joseph was, and he began to show him a lot of investment, a lot of resource. He showed him a lot of attention, and the brothers who were older, who had been working longer, who had built the house, who had invested longer, they felt like they were being slighted. And imagine just for a moment, sometimes in the church, one generation might say, well, we built it, we invested in it, we've poured all into it, and suddenly here comes the snot-nosed little-nosed brat generation that's coming up, and they get to benefit from all the things that we did. We did all the hard work. Why do they get all the attention? Now, it says that Joseph was given a special coat, and many of you know it as the coat of many colors. Anyone ever seen Joseph in the Technicolor dream coat? Well, I'm about to kind of burst that bubble for just a moment, because even though it says in Scripture that it was a coat of many colors, this is a translation of a Hebrew word that actually means ornate. Now, early English translators, they saw ornate, they thought, well, that must mean it's colorful, and that's why they put many colors. And it very well could have been. But the better interpretation, or better translation of that word, being ornate, is that it was a tunic with long sleeves. Now, that might not mean anything to us today, but if the average tunic did not have sleeves at all, and Joseph's had sleeves, you can imagine what that must have meant. You see, if you had a tunic with no sleeves, it probably meant that you're about to get your hands dirty and you're about to do a lot of manual work because those sleeves are going to get in the way. When you're pulling sheep out of the thistles and you're getting down and it's getting ugly, you're going to need to take off the jacket and not have the sleeves. And Joseph is over here with his long-sleeved tunic, which probably symbolized he wasn't going to have to lift a finger. He wasn't going to have to do any work. In fact, because we see later in his life that he seems to have an aptitude for knowledge, it's arguable that Jacob had him stay back so that he could learn how to read and write and administrate, because he was going to serve in a management role over the family. And the 10 brothers are like, wait. We have done all the work. We've poured in. We've invested. And you're focusing all of your attention on Joseph. Now, Joseph and his brothers represent 2 different generations. Now, even though they were brothers, they were 2 different generations. Me and my brother's 6.5 years older than me, and technically, even though we're brothers, we fall into 2 different generations. He's a Gen X, I'm a millennial. Please don't hold that against me. but two different generations, and that's what we see here. Because sometimes when we think about generations, we consider the older versus the younger, and that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about all types of generations who feel like sometimes other generations get more attention than they do. Now, why did Jacob focus on Joseph? Why did he invest so much? Well, we already said he was Rachel's son. He was his son of old age. He was the son of promise. But there was also another thing. Remember, it says that Jacob kept these things in his mind. He saw something in Joseph, and even though he corrected his immaturity, even though he corrected his approach, he realized that God was putting something in him that would be necessary to save the promise down the line. He realized that God had put gifts in him, that God had instilled something in him that was going to be necessary later on down the road. And even though he knew that Joseph wasn't approaching it the right way, he knew that needed to be cultivated. So he began to invest in Joseph. He began to invest in him so much that the brothers felt slighted. He began to take resources and put it toward Joseph. And the brothers said, "But what about us? We've been working. What about us? We need to be fed. What about us? We need your attention too." And it might feel very similar to when a church comes along and says, "You know what, we really want to focus on our next generation. And so when Camp Creation goes on, we're going to shut down every other ministry in the church for that week because we want to invest in the next generation." You might say, "But what about us? What about my small group? What about my ministry? Why is it that group is so special?" And can I tell you this morning? It's because we see in the next generation, not that they're more special, but that God has put something in them, not at the expense of anyone else, but He's put something in them that will preserve the promise in years to come. And it's our job to pass the promise, to prepare them so that they can receive the promise. And so just like Jacob, sometimes we focus a little bit more on one generation, and other generations tend to begin to compare. And they begin to say, "Wait, what about us? What's so special about them?" Through this series and this year, we've been focusing on unity. We've talked a lot about what unity looks like, but we haven't talked a lot about what unity shouldn't look like, or what disunity looks like, I should say. We're going to be doing a series in a few months called Counterfeit Communities or something like that, where we talk about what the church tends to become when we don't have unity in it, when we form a counterfeit community. And just to kind of give you a taste of that, James chapter 3, verse 16 says, "For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there is disorder and every evil practice." For where there is envy and there is selfish ambition, there is disorder and every evil practice. We see envy here in this story. We see selfish ambition. And the brothers, they say, "Why does he get it and we don't?" And the Bible says that this causes disorder and every evil practice. So we see a story where there's great dysfunction. We see a story where there's great disorder. And the question becomes, who's in the wrong here? We like to do that in stories. We like to look and see who's to blame. And I've got a couple theories. First of all, I would say that Jacob is to blame. Jacob is the one that showed favoritism to Joseph. And not just favoritism, because there's a way to focus on the next generation, to invest in them without taking away from everyone else. But Jacob didn't do that. He focused so much on Joseph that the others felt slighted. Jacob was in the wrong. Now, it's kind of like churches that I've heard that will say, I heard a church not too long ago, they sent out a letter to everyone in the church who was over the age of 65 and asked them not to attend for the next 2 years so that they could focus on the next generation. Well, I don't have to tell you that did not go very well. But this is sort of what Jacob did. He focused so much on one son that the others were completely shortchanged. When we focus on one generation at the expense of others, there's a problem. But that door swings both ways. Because sometimes we can become so focused on the generation who has influence today that we take the next generation and we shove them into the corner of a basement and say, well, one day will be your time, but today's ours. You see, whenever we focus so much on one generation at the expense of others, we do what Jacob did, and I will say Jacob was in the wrong. The brothers were also in the wrong. They were so blinded by jealousy and by selfish ambition that they were unable to see the gift that God had put in Joseph. It didn't mean that they didn't have gifts. It didn't mean that they didn't have things that God was doing in them. But what they needed to see was that God was putting something in Joseph that they didn't have, because God was investing in Joseph something that would preserve the promise tomorrow, not just today. They had an opportunity. Even though Joseph was immature, even though Joseph was needed to grow, they had an opportunity to cultivate this gift. They chose not to do that. They chose to let their jealousy and their selfish ambition to blind them. And we see in Genesis chapter 37:18, it says, they saw him in the distance, and before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, oh, look, here comes the dream expert. So now come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him, then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. You know, sometimes whenever we begin to see God doing something in someone else's life, we begin to see that he's investing in them. We begin to see the gifts that that he's put in them. We begin to see their dreams. We begin to feel like we're inferior. We begin to feel jealous of it. And instead of creating environments for their dreams and their giftings to grow, we say, let's kill them and let's see what happens to their dreams then. We allow jealousy and we allow selfish ambition to blind us, and this is what takes place. When Reuben, the oldest, heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, let's not take his life. Reuben also said to them, don't shed blood. Throw him into the pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, intending to rescue him from them and return him to his father. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the robe that had many colors on it, and they had took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty without water. They sat down to eat a meal, and when they looked up, there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin going down to Egypt. You see, the brothers could not appreciate what God was putting in Joseph. And instead of creating an environment for him to grow into his giftings, instead of recognizing what God was doing inside of Joseph, they sent him off to Egypt. Now remember, Egypt represents the culture that wants nothing more than to see your family destroyed, the culture that wants nothing more than to work against the work of God. We see Egypt many places in Scripture, and it always represents a power and a principality that is coming against the work of God. Now God might use Egypt in certain ways, but Egypt wants nothing more than its own selfish ambition and agenda to be pushed, and this is where they send Joseph. And when he gets to Egypt, he becomes a slave. But because of the giftings that God has put in him, and because Egypt has a knack of identifying gifts, he becomes the slave of all slaves in the house. He becomes an administrator, until he's falsely accused and he's put in prison. But even in prison, the God-given gifts in him are cultivated and they grow, and the prison guards begin to realize and identify that there's something in him, and suddenly he becomes the chief prisoner in all the prison. And because of that, people begin to listen to him, and they hear his dreams, and they hear his interpretation, and it catches the ear of Pharaoh, who is the king of Egypt, the most powerful man in the world at the time. And he says, I've got a dream, bring Joseph to me. Joseph comes and he knows the dream and he gives an interpretation. And a long story short, the dream says that there will be 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And if they will stockpile in the years of plenty, then they'll have what they need in the years of famine. And Pharaoh says, well, Joseph, you seem to have a plan, so why don't you go ahead and do it? And he names him. He goes from being a slave to a prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. Why? Because Egypt was able to see the gift that God had put in him. You see, if we don't create an environment where the gifts and the callings of the next generation are cultivated, you better believe that we're going to drive them out to Egypt. And Egypt has a knack at identifying and cultivating and using the gifts of young people for their own benefit. If we don't create an environment where their giftings are birthed and their giftings are cultivated and they're used for God's purposes, they will find their worth in Egypt. We have a mission to come alongside our young people and raise them up, to grow them, to identify what God's doing inside of them, cultivate that, and help them to use it for God's purposes. Now, Jacob was at fault. The brothers were at fault. And can I just be real honest with you? Joseph was just a little punk. He was. He was a snot-nosed, arrogant punk. And can I be real today and say sometimes my generation has a tendency to be that way. We know we're gifted, and we want you to know it too. We know what God's doing in our lives, and we want to make sure you know it. It's not that we lack giftedness, it's that we lack maturity. And young people in the room today know that there are people who have come before you, who have wrestled many of the things that you've wrestled, and they have a lot of advice for you. And if you'll just stop and listen, then you can allow God to do something in your life that you couldn't do without them. Why? Because your story didn't start with you. But equally, for the generation that obviously often just dismisses the gifts that are there, the story doesn't end with you either. We need each other to come together. You see, Joseph was not without fault. He was arrogant. He was immature. But during his time in prison, during his time in slavery, he began to grow. He began to mature. He began to realize that in large part his arrogance was what got him to that point. He begins to grow. He begins to see how God put things in him, how he's supposed to use them for the benefit of others, not just to create a platform for himself. And when the famine comes, it doesn't just strike Egypt, it strikes the whole world, at least the civilized world of that day, including Joseph's brothers. Joseph's brothers come looking to buy grain. They don't recognize Joseph, he recognizes them. And you would think that this would be the prime opportunity for him to strike with a vengeance and for him to come after his brothers for what they did. But because of what God began to cultivate in him in Egypt, he doesn't do that. Instead, he says in Genesis 45, 5-7, and now don't be grieved or angry with yourself for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. What happened to Joseph while he was in prison? What happened to him while he was in slavery? You see, he began to realize that he was not the main character of his own story. We would do well in our own lives to realize that we are not the main character in our own story. He realized that there was a much larger story that was playing out that he was simply a part of. He realized that while his brothers harmed him, God was using this for good. In fact, the famous verse that many of you may know, Genesis 50:20, says, "You planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many families." What he's doing here is he's fostering unity. Generational unity creates an environment for the promise to thrive. Generational unity says, I know that at times you offend me. I know that at times you grieve me. I know that at times you diminish the value that I bring to the table, but I'm choosing to look past that. I'm choosing to be unified because it's not about me having the spotlight. It's about the promise being carried. When we come together with generational unity, it creates an environment for the promise to thrive. You see, often we look at the next generation with suspicion, or maybe we look at the generation before us with suspicion, and we don't understand why they prioritize the things that they do. Young people, the generation before us, they prioritized what they did because they needed to prioritize it to do what God had called them to do then. But equally so, sometimes we look at the next generation and they have different priorities. They have different focuses. They have different things that God's instilled in them. And we can easily look at that with suspicion and say, why aren't you focused on the things that I was focused on? It's because they have a different assignment than you did. They're going to have to do things that you and I can't even wrap our minds around. They're going to have to prioritize things that didn't exist in our lifetime. We often look at the old songs and we say, they need to sing the old songs. They need to know the old songs. No, they need to know the truth of the old song, but they need to sing a song of their own. The first song that we sang for worship, many of you don't know this, but that song was actually written by our very own Mark Johnson. And it's a song that captures where we are today. And while it's no better or no worse than a song written 100 years ago, those songs were written for a time then. And there's still songs that we can celebrate. There's still songs that have value. But that same truth can be sung in a song that's a new song today that captures where we are, captures the assignment that was given, captures what God is doing now, not just what He was doing then. Maybe instead of being suspicious, we can come alongside the generation that isn't our own and we can say, why is it that you value social media? What do you see that I don't? And maybe for a younger generation, you can come alongside those who came before you and said, where are the anchors of faith in this little red book behind the pew that I don't understand? Teach me the truth that's there. Teach me how to sing it my own. Teach me how to wrestle with it and make it my own. It's not difficult to look at the story of Joseph and realize that the end of the story, Joseph realized that there was a much bigger story going on than just his own. And often we look at that and say, well, sure, God was protecting Egypt. He was protecting the world. He was protecting them from the famine, and that's part of it. But the actual story that we see starting in Genesis isn't contained in Genesis. You see, because there's a fact that we often overlook. The promise made to Abraham was about a seed, about a descendant. And that promise was passed down from Abraham. It was passed down to Isaac, not to Ishmael, his other son. It was passed to Isaac. And from Isaac, it was passed to Jacob, not Esau, his other son, to Jacob. And when we talk about the four patriarchs, we talk about Abraham, we talk about Isaac, we talk about Jacob, and then we talk about Joseph. But what we don't always pay attention to is that Joseph was not carrying the promise. Jacob had 12 sons. They would go on to become the 12 tribes of Israel. And before his death, he blessed each of his sons. And in Genesis 49, 8 through 10, he blesses his son Judah. He says, Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the kill. He crouches, he lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares arouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belongs to him. If you'll stand with me. If you did not receive communion elements on your way in, or ushers, or coming down the aisle, if you'll just slip your hand up, they'd be more than happy to bring them to you. Judah went on to become the tribal leader of the tribe of Judah, and generation after generation after generation, we meet a young shepherd boy named David, who sits on the throne of Israel, just like Jacob prophesied that he would. And while he's on the throne of Israel, he's given a promise that one day his descendants would sit on the throne forever. You see, that promise that passed from Abraham to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah, to David, birthed Jesus. And the night before Jesus' crucifixion, he gathered his disciples together for the Passover meal. He took the bread and he broke it. He said, "This is my body given for you. Take it and eat." Then he took the cup and he poured it out. He said, "This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for the forgiveness of sin. Take it and drink." And as he went to the cross and he died for our sins, he was buried, he rose again on the third day, and he told his disciples to go and proclaim the good news. Even though our church is 165 years old, our story didn't start there either. Our story started on the day of Pentecost when the church was birthed. And the promise that we possess, the promise that we carry, was passed from generation to generation, one generation passing, one generation receiving, all generations wrestling, and the church protecting that promise. You see, Joseph understood something that we often forget. He understood that the promise made to Abraham was not just a promise about land. It was not just a promise about a nation. It was not just a promise that Abraham could understand. It was a promise that would lead from generation to generation to generation until it led to Jesus. It was always about Jesus. It will always be about Jesus. And the promise that we carry of the gospel that we are to proclaim to all people of all generations has always been about Jesus, will always be about Jesus. It's about Jesus today. Joseph realized that he was not the main character of his own story. He realized that he was playing a role. He was there to protect the promise. He was there to protect the promise that his brother was carrying. And in this room today, you may look at other generations and say, why do they get the focus? Why do they get the attention? Why do they get the resources? What about me? And I would encourage you to consider Joseph, who said, it's not about me. It's about the promise. If we ever invest in a generation, if we ever pour our resources in, it's because we see the promise and the future tomorrow, not because the rest of us don't have the promise, but because we see what God is doing there for the future. So we invest. When we say, what about me? When we say, where's the attention on me? We are forgetting that it's about promise. This morning as we worship, we reflect. Invite our prayer partners to come up front. If you want to pray with somebody up here, feel free to do that. If you want to just pray by yourself in the middle, you can do that. If you want to stay in your seats, that's fine. The altar isn't a place, it's a posture of the heart. It's a place where we come and we say, God, I can't do this on my own. I need you to empty me out so that you can fill me up. So often we get caught up saying, this is my time. Saying, what about me? And we have to realize that it was never our time. It's always ever been His time. We get to be a part of it. This series was a call to intergenerational unity, not one generation picking up the slack for another, but all generations coming together for a common goal, a common mission, a common purpose, that purpose being to carry the promise, to ensure that it doesn't get dropped in the next generation. So the call is for intergenerational unity. So the response today is, will you answer that call? Will you become comfortable if the spotlight isn't on you, so we can do what we're called to do and cultivate the promise to make sure it's passed from generation to generation? Will you answer the call to intergenerational unity? As we worship today, as we reflect, I invite you to allow the Holy Spirit to do the work that only He